So we're going to begin this evening with a prayer selected by Jan.
Okay, I selected a prayer out of the Prayers for Evening section, and this is a prayer I've loved for a long time. Keep watch, dear Lord, with those who work or watch or weep this night, and give thine angels charge over those who sleep. Tend the sick, Lord Christ, give rest to the weary, bless the dying, soothe the suffering, pity the afflicted, shield the joyous, and all for thy love's sake. Amen.
Amen. So let's see if we can get started with the sharing the screen. Do I need to make this a little larger for folks?
Don't see anything yet.
Oh, I haven't pressed the share button, I guess, yeah. Oops, share. No, that's not. I better start this again. Share screen. Share. What am I doing here? I see you, but I don't. I rehearsed this too, and what am I doing wrong? No. I'm so sorry. I should be doing this better. Share screen. Do you see it?
No.
Don't see it yet. There we go.
Now you see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Is it large enough?
No.
Is it large enough?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, down to chapter 6. Look how much territory we've covered, people. Centuries. I wanted to mention something of a little correction that I made. I omitted one act of uniformity. There are actually 4, and I left out the one in 1552, which didn't matter that much because it was the one that was interrupted by the death of Edward VI and the accession of Queen Mary, who suppressed the Book of Common Prayer and put Thomas Cranmer to death. So that was uniformity for a very short time, but I've inserted that, so the making the sequence 1549, 1552, then 1559 after Elizabeth became queen, and finally 1662 with the restoration of the monarchy and the accession of Charles II to the crown. We ended our last gathering with the passing in 1874 of the Public Worship Regulation Act. This was again an attempt to calm down all the conflict between the high church and the low church parties, the more Protestant, the more Catholic parties. And it was enforced by law, but the strict enforcement of it proved very, very unpopular. And so it really lapsed into non-enforcement. What was happening, I think, was just the gradual development in all of Europe of a sense of freedom of conscience and individual rights in religion. So I added this at the very bottom. In effect, the Public Worship Regulation Act was a successor to the Fourth Act of Uniformity of 1662, but it had even less prospect of achieving actual uniformity around the Book of Common Prayer than had the earlier four parliamentary acts. So now we're moving ahead to chapter 6, the pressures of the modern. And at the beginning of this section, what Alan Jacobs focuses on in particular is the modernization of language. Although everyone admires Thomas Cranmer's noble, sober prose and all the biblical and poetic kinds of balance that he achieves, alliteration and so forth, it was getting rather old and even incomprehensible to people who were speaking English in the late 19th and early 20th century. But it was difficult to bring about modernizations of it, partly because some people in the general population were attached, but also because you had to have the consent of Parliament. Well, change was in the air. So in 1877, the Church of Ireland modernized its edition of the Book of Common Prayer in an evangelical direction. The Church of Canada modernized in a Catholic direction. In 1879, because after all, the King James Version came into existence during the same period, early 17th century, they began to modernize it, but discovered, again, so much attachment to the old language that the modernization was very faint. It didn't really amount to very much. The Episcopal Church of the USA, however, had been poking around, revising the Book of Common Prayer in the USA all through the 19th century, many little tweaks. Every few years, it seemed there was a change. And then in 1892, a top to bottom, culminating reworking of the whole. So all of this was happening, you might say, while back home in Britain, the Mother Church, things were in a state of semi-paralysis. But in 1906, the report of the Royal Commission on Ecclesiastical Discipline in Britain recommends allowing various high church ritual practices that the official Book of Common Prayer has proscribed ever since the ornaments rubric was imposed in the 16th century. I think that actually may go back to 1552. However, the report makes no recommendation about updating the language of the Book of Common Prayer. With the prayer book, as with the Bible, a conservative attachment to the now antique 16th century language prevails. But then comes World War I, 1914 to 1918. After a century of peace that people had begun to think would continue indefinitely, Europe is plunged into the unprecedented horror of World War I. Europe's first industrially powered war. Memoirs published during the war and later in Britain about that period recount the felt inadequacy of the language of the Book of Common Prayer's funeral liturgy. I have to revise that, add that word, funeral liturgy, to the needs of soldiers while the battles raged and mourners later. Priests who served as chaplains during the war reported that the illiterate or barely literate foot soldiers they were charged to serve could make no sense of 16th century diction and syntax, and were therefore left uncomforted in their time of need. Meanwhile, certain Catholic practices, including prayers for the dead, which were not common in Anglicanism at that time, had proved appealing to men under fire, and the memory of this contributed to pressure for a major revision of the Book of Common Prayer after the war. After the war, the Canadian Anglicans revised their edition. The American Episcopalians did so as well, notably in the matrimonial rite. But after 4 years of wrangling in Britain, the recommendation of a revision was handed over to Parliament, and Parliament just voted it down, 266 to 220. And officially, in other words, the English Book of Common Prayer remains still, to this day, the 1662 edition. But the stage is clearly set for a more searching reconsideration of worship, both especially of Eucharistic worship. Now, I have inserted here 1939 to 1945 dates to represent World War II. Alan Jacobs makes much of the impact of World War I on the life of the church and on the continued validity, you might say, or appeal of the Book of Common Prayer. He doesn't say anything per se about World War II. And I wonder, whether it such a catastrophic event, there must be more that could be said about the place of the Book of Common Prayer in England before, after, and perhaps because of the war. In any case, what he does do is jump ahead to just after the war, 1945, when this interesting fellow, a Benedictine monk, but an Anglican Benedictine. I didn't know that I knew there were Anglican monks and nuns, but I never heard them referred to by the term Benedictine before, but he was such a person. He publishes his book, The Shape of the Liturgy, a hugely influential study of the full history of Eucharistic worship from the beginning, meaning that by the time you get down to the 16th, 17th, 18th century, you're in the latter chapters of the book. But still, at the Reformation, a great debate had emerged. Were the Christian sacraments just memorials of past events in history? Or did they affect what they also memorialized for those who took part in them? So when you received baptism, was it just reminding you that Christ had died for your sins, or did something happen to you because of that action? That was the Catholic view. It was also, to a considerable degree, a Lutheran view. But the Calvinists and Zwinglians said, no, these things have happened once and for all. All you can do is believe in them, salvation by faith alone. And there's no need really for these sacraments, unless simply as a little reminder, kind of acted out reminder of actions that happened that brought about our salvation in the past. So what about the Book of Common Prayer? Well, Anglicans, Gregory Dix argued, had inherited a Eucharistic liturgy, the ceremonials in the Book of Common Prayer that strongly suggested mere memorial, but the official theology, notably that of Richard Hooker, stoutly affirmed the sacramental one. So we were at 6s and 7s in our Book of Common Prayer, said Father Dix or Reverend Dix. This and many other inconsistencies and internal contradictions in the Book of Common Prayer called less for a revision in Dix's view than for a radical repudiation. Jacobs writes, it is impossible not to think that Dix's book was written precisely in order to dethrone Cranmer, to repudiate his work, and to exhort Anglicans to set their liturgy on a firmer and better footing. Gregory Dix was a very Anglo-Catholic Anglican. He would have been happy, I think, this is clear between the lines, maybe even in so many words, in Alan Jacobs, for a reunification of the Church of England to take place with the Church of Rome. In any case, though people were very, very impressed by his scholarship and did see now more clearly than ever that there was a case for revising the Book of Common Prayer, they weren't about to submit themselves to the Pope. That was not going to happen. So his influence was to work out in other ways. And the big surprise is that India, of all places, plays a key role. It is in 1947 that India achieves independence from Britain, and the Church of South India comes into existence. A merger joining Anglicans with Methodists, Congregationalists, and Presbyterians in newly independent India. What follows, the late 40s through the 50s, liturgical creativity in various major Indian languages. India has more languages than Europe, you know. Led by English clerics and scholars, this activity draws heavily on the thinking of Gregory Dix, most notably, but by no means exclusively, on his discovery that historically, all Christian Eucharistic prayers have followed a four-stage shape: the taking of the bread or wine, officially the offertory, praying over it, the invocation, breaking of the bread, and giving it to the faithful. Amid many, many variations over the centuries, those four structural elements were always there. And what people took away from this was that once you held onto those four, there was quite a bit of freedom to try other language, yes.
Sorry to disturb you here, but Julie wants to be let in, she says.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't notice. Has she been waiting there for a long time?
I don't know. She just texted me.
There she is.
Yeah, there she is.
Sorry for the interruption.
There she is. Okay, hi, Julie. So we're working, have you been waiting a long time? I apologize.
Not at all. I immediately texted Rico.
Oh, okay. So we're talking about how the Book of Common Prayer was influenced at a time when people had a general sense that it was due for revision and modernization by a great historian of the church, Gregory Dix, who published his book, The Shape of the Liturgy, a full origins to the 20th century history of how the Eucharist had been celebrated by the church at each stage. This left people with a sense that so long as the four key elements that he had identified were retained, there could be quite a bit of further freedom, but it was in India, surprisingly, that his thought was really put into practice and employed for a serious revision of the Book of Common Prayer. After India achieved independence through the late 40s and into the 50s, there was a great deal of experimentation liturgically in different linguistic communities in India. And finally, in 1963, the Church of South India published its Book of Common Worship, the fruit of all those years of liturgical discussion and ecumenical cooperation. the CSI Church of South India prayer book brings the thought of Gregory Dix to a substantial population of Christians there in India, only some of them Anglicans, and establishes an influential precedent for world Anglicanism. I would think it was a precedent because of the degree to which Anglicans are in touch with one another through the periodic meetings in Lambeth and in other ways. As it happened, in that very year, the Second Vatican Council issues its historic constitution on the sacred liturgy, by which Catholic Eucharistic worship is henceforth to take place in vernacular languages rather than in Latin. In the Roman Catholic Church, this was an earthquake. But what struck the Anglican world most about the Constitution, Jacobs writes, was the creation of multiple rites for the Mass. He writes, if even Rome no longer felt it necessary to have but one use, why should Anglicans insist on the point? So the door is open even more widely now to variety in worship. In 1974, getting quite close now to our own time, the Church of England authorizes the creation of an alternative service book, ASB, so called because as long as the Book of Common Prayer itself was not tampered with, Parliament need not become entangled in the deliberations. So the Book of Common Prayer was there as an alternative, the original alternative, but now you had this other option. And since it wasn't a revision of the Book of Common Prayer, it was available to everybody. Parliamentary approval was not needed. Jacobs comments in what seems almost like an epitaph. The book Cranmer created, so carefully modified over the next century, so minutely adjusted in the many years that succeeded, was now being urged, not so always gently, to the sidelines of Anglican life. It strikes me that what might seem equally significant is that by this evasion of state authority, the fusion of church and state effected by Henry VIII in 1534 is significantly undermined. The church is escaping the authority of the state, not entirely, but to some significant degree. Here at home, 1979, the Episcopal Church in the United States publishes a major revision of the American Book of Common Prayer. Following the Vatican II Constitution on Sacred Liturgy, it allows several different communion rites. We've heard them all, I think, at church at one point or another, since the Episcopalians have no parliament to cope with and no need to create anything like an alternative service book to evade parliamentary intervention. It would seem that the Book of Common Prayer has not been urged to the sidelines of Episcopal life in the USA. Be that as it may, what has most clearly happened is that the book for one country, was the title of Jacobs's first chapter, is well en route to many books for many countries, which is the title of his seventh and last chapter, the one that we will talk about when we get together for our reunion in person here at Kitty and Jack's homestead. So many books for many countries, and yet apples, even when they fall far from the tree, are still apples, aren't they? I think so. And let me now stop the screen share so we can all smile at each other again. Martin, we need you here to smile at. So reading this, I found this chapter a surprisingly challenging read. I read it twice. There he is. It's a rather tricky, elusive process that was taking place, but was there something about it that puzzled you? Something that you think will stick with you, or something that you particularly liked learning about?
Well, I think what will stick with me is his addressing the impact of World War One. That when grim reality, such as we're facing today, intervenes, sometimes the loftiness of the prayers just aren't gritty enough for the reality that we're dealing with. And that made a lot of sense to me.
Yes, I'd like to share. Yeah, I also liked what Linda said, sort of this idea of the book being adapted to different sort of socio-cultural needs and also, I guess, temporal needs across the ages. And I suppose I assume we'll see more of that in the next chapter when it talks about how the book has been adapted to different countries more. But yeah, I liked the bit on the Church of South India. I have a friend who grew up in Boston, but her family's from Kerala in South India, and they've been Christians for, I guess, a long time, and for many generations. And she was saying that, oh, it's similar to the Episcopalian Church, according to her. And so I always wondered about that. And then last year, my mother and I were in New Mexico in Santa Fe at a cathedral there. And there's a tour group from India, and a priest was leading them. And he was wearing this cap with like embroidery on it. I suppose it's like a skull cap that I think I've seen maybe like Orthodox Christian priests wear, maybe, I'm not sure. But anyway, we asked one of the people there, asked them, oh, like whereabouts in India are you from? And it turned out that they were, I think, they were from Kerala too, and they were speaking Malayalam. They were praying in Malayalam, which was in this chapter. So it's kind of interesting to read about that as well after seeing them a few months ago.
But those Christians at that cathedral, it was a Catholic cathedral, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if, would they have a similar worship routine as other Christians do in India? Do you know, Jack?
Well, the Christianity, as it's, we generally think of Christianity as spreading west around the Mediterranean, which is correct. The journeys of St. Paul into what is now Turkey and as far as Greece, and then even to Rome, and spreading across North Africa, and then spreading east to Damascus, and then from Damascus to Mesopotamia, into Iran, and following the Silk Route as far as China. But Christianity did also spread south. Egypt, the church in Egypt was hugely influential from the beginning. In Egypt, Greek was certainly known, and particularly in the northern part of the country, but further south, the language was Coptic, which was vernacular descendant from the language of ancient Egypt. And then south of Egypt, you have Ethiopia, and spreading south along the shore of the Indian Ocean, on the east side, or rather the west side of India, you do come to Kerala. And their lore, we might say, says that they were evangelized. I think I've heard it for two traditions, one by St. James and the other by St. Philip, I think. In any case, when the British arrived in India, those Christians were already there. So they are definitely a very ancient church, and they, they run themselves. They are an autocephalous church, to use the technical term. But there is interaction now between them for centuries, especially with I think Roman Catholics are numerous in Kerala. Though the distinction is made, but they make a distinction between the St. James Kerala Catholics and the those who may have become Catholic or are practicing Catholicism as brought by missionaries in modern times. Because of course, India was a British colony for such a long time. You also, of course, have the Church of England there in strength. But the story of the Church of South India makes clear is that once they had a secular state, then without an established religion, then the door was open for a kind of ecumenical movement, to begin, and the different Protestant denominations joined to create this a Church of South India. And it also seemed to me, as I read Jacob's account of how working together they developed their Book of Common Worship, that the Book of Common Prayer seemed to be spreading, to be used by Indian Methodists, Indian Presbyterians, Indian Congregationalists. I don't know, if I haven't looked at the actual Book of Common Prayer of India, but I just have a hunch that the overall Anglican influence on it is probably pretty strong.
See, growing up in England, we had Series 2. It was called Series 2, and it came in a blue book, and that was the communion service. And it was very widely used at about that time in 1970s, 1980s. But I feel that England just kind of sidestepped the whole question of Book of Common Prayer just by coming up with various different service sheets that got used on a completely ad hoc basis. And then, of course, Series 2 was superseded by Series 3. And meanwhile, everybody was going in all different directions at the same time. I mean, as far as high church people were concerned, Series 2 was not Catholic enough, whereas the low church people thought this was a piece of pure papistry. So in the end, everybody just went off and did their own thing.
Well, maybe that's a kind of confirmation of his saying that the Book of Common Prayer was gently moved to the sidelines, and people
exactly, yeah,
were doing what they wanted. But Martin, Series 2, Series 3, and the leaflets that were produced along the way, would you say that they all had a strong family resemblance, a generic resemblance to what we have at Messiah now? I mean, to the kind of a core.
Yeah, I mean, structurally and some of the language, definitely. Series 2 was thee and thou, and it grates on me to this day to hear you in the service. That's just me, but that was the kind of watershed. Series 2 to Series 3 was the watershed where thee gave way to you.
Isn't that what happened in the Episcopal Church in 1979 with Rite 2? Wasn't Rite 2? I mean, I haven't been an Episcopalian that long. I've only been in the church, it's been a long time, 30 years, but still, it was after 1979, a little bit after it anyway. But wasn't that the change? I mean, Rite 2 uses you, and didn't Rite 1 use thee and thou? Can anybody answer me?
Julie was nodding. You turned off, Julie.
You're
You
muted.
muted.
Just from using Right One occasionally, that is the case. You know, and when we have Right One and David has to remind us to use the proper language, and isn't that right, Mariko?
think so.
We're
Do
such
they-
good Episcopalians.
Thee and thou it? I don't know.
Mhm.
I would ask Kitty.
When I first came to Mississippi,
It's been a long
we
time
had
since
right
I
one
heard
at
thee
the
and
8
thou.
o'clock service.
I'm with Julie. Yes, I mean, if you've heard Right One, yes, you've heard the end of,
Yeah.
So,
Mhm.
and I think it has its place. That we actually, there are times when in our own liturgy, though most of the time it's you and your and so forth, that we will get a brief prayer or something that
So-
uses the older.
So here's a funny thing. At the time of publication of Series 3, which was you and you, my grandfather in the north of England, he still used thee and thou.
Oh, in just an ordinary conversation.
In ordinary conversation, he'd say, get thy boots on, meaning put your shoes on, or yeah, get the boots on. So that was thy. How art thou? Yeah,
Well,
just regular conversation.
Grammatically, thou and thee are the older singular form of the second person pronoun, and you and your are the plural form. But now we have eliminated the difference between singular and plural by using only you, although what I observe is that there are two colloquial movements into that breach. There is you and y'all, and what we have in California all the time now, completely eliminating any notion of gender, is you and you guys.
Well,
You
and
guys.
if you've lived in Texas, it's all y'all. If there is more than one
Yeah.
y'all.
But I think that if you go into I think this is the case, that if I'm alone in a restaurant, they'd say, you may sit wherever you like, and if I go in with a group, they say, well, where would you guys like to sit? So it is used. The distinction is a singular plural distinction.
Well, and interestingly, the word guys becomes gender neutral.
Yes.
But I believe that only applies in California. This is what I've read. I haven't lived
Oh,
other
yes?
places so recently. No, yeah, it's a California thing. Is guys.
Well,
I
I
think
try
that-
not to say that in class now. I try to say folks or something.
Yeah.
Because it is, it is
Not-
masculine. It's
right.
supposed to be.
It's not gender neutral,
Yeah.
not to women.
Well, that's right.
Right. For men, it's gender neutral.
Yeah,
For
that's
women,
right.
no.
I'm trying to say that it is used in a general neutral context, not that it is literally gender neutral. It's applied in that sense.
Not that you necessarily endorse it, perhaps.
Exactly. Well, there are many things in California I don't personally.
Don't get him started.
Well, I quit saying it after I quit saying you guys. Gosh, Len and I have been married 41 years, but early on, his Kentucky family made so much fun of me for saying you guys. I didn't make fun of them for saying you all, but
Well, in Chicago, where I grew up, we had our own plural for you. It was yous.
Right.
Yeah.
I was going to say that.
Well, in my neighborhood, it wasn't, but that was like, Chicago was a pretty divided place.
Or yous or yous guys.
you guys, I think that is in Jersey. Come on, you guys.
Well, back for a moment. When I was at social service, one of my coworkers, her last name was Jesudasa, which means disciple of Jesus. So I thought that was neat.
What
This
was
was-
it? Sorry?
Jesu Dasa was her last name.
Do you know where she was?
Disciple.
What nationality was this?
She was Indian, but I don't
Indian.
know. Yeah,
Very nice.
Huh.
yeah.
So Jack, when you were talking about Vatican II, and you said that it came sort of not at the same time, but in sort of in the same period as when the Book of Common Prayer was being thrown to the wind and rewritten, and all these, especially on the issue of the Eucharist and all that. So what was the situation with Vatican? So was it that before Vatican II, they only had one rite?
Yes. Well, not quite. The overwhelming majority of Catholics celebrated the Mass in Latin,
Right.
but there were some variations in Latin. For example, there was a Mass for the dead that was different from other masses, but everything was in Latin, and there were variations in Latin that could have to do with a particular a saint's day. In addition to that, there were liturgies in other languages, like Arabic, for example. There's a Mozarabic rite. So it was Catholics who recognized the authority of the Pope and understood themselves to be part of the same Catholic Church, but they were allowed to celebrate the liturgy in their own language, even though it wasn't necessarily a vernacular language. It was an ancient language, but it was allowed to continue in their community. There was also a liturgy in what the language called Old Church Slavonic, which would be the liturgy in which Ukrainian Catholics, who were not Orthodox but Roman Catholic, would say recite their liturgies. But these added all together, these would still add up to a minority. But it does, I guess, make the point that within its obviously very hierarchical structure, the Roman Catholic Church had made certain accommodations over time to linguistic diversity. What it comes through in Jacob's pretty clearly, though I suppose he could have underlined it even more, is that in Western Christendom, there was a liturgical movement that spanned across church borders. There was a learned interest in where the inherited liturgies had come from and their deeper history, and there was a certain excitement in rediscovering how Christians were worshiping, let's say, in the 5th century, much closer, obviously, to the time of Christ. Garments, practices, for example, it seems that the further back you go, the more often people are standing rather than kneeling. It's a simple detail like that. You could look at illuminated manuscripts and observe the shape of the vestments that were being worn. And then, like the enthusiasm in classical music for ancient instruments, the Academy of Ancient Music, there was an antiquarian element to it, but there was also a certain kind of excitement in getting back to how the first followers, getting closer to how the first followers of Jesus kept his memory alive and honored God and honored him as they had been taught to do by his earliest followers. So that was a part of it, you know, and then it just what that came down to in terms of changes in how people in the 20th century now into the 21st actually conducted their religious lives. Well, there was a variety, you know, people were reading some of each other's books, drawing on some of the same sources, but taking it in different ways. A very big change, of course, was the Roman Catholic Church now celebrating its liturgy in the vernacular, and also with turning the priest to face the people. This is normal for us, but once the priest, it's been said, you know, well, if you go to Catholic Church, the priest is facing God and everybody's facing God. If you go to a Protestant church, the priest is facing you and you're facing him, and God is somewhere in the background. A different kind of religious experience, if you want to look at it that way, you know. But in any case, the Catholic Church decided to conform to what had become the standard Protestant pattern, a very big change.
I once went to an Anglican service in Malaysia, and the priest was Indian, and he actually faced the altar.
Well,
And this
you know,
was not that long
that's-
ago. It was in the 90s.
I had that experience myself once in an island off the coast of New Hampshire, believe it or not. Why I was there and who I was with is, it would be a very long story. But with us was a great scholar of comparative religion, an Englishman, John Bowker is his name. And there was a little chapel there, and he invited anyone who wanted to attend early Mass, and Mass was the word he used, to come. So I went, anticipating that I would be attending an Anglican service, and it was in English, but in every particular, it was the Roman Catholic Mass of my boyhood. I could have been his altar boy. He did, and he was facing the cross, facing the altar rather than the people. And in many other, I think there were changes that had there were practices that the Catholic Church had left behind, but he was still retaining them.
St.
But this was
Michael's,
an Episcopal service, or?
It was an Episcopal service. Oh yes.
St. Michael's.
I mean, not Episcopal. He was from England, so it was.
Oh yeah, and
It was
okay.
an Anglican service.
You can see that kind of service at St. Michael's in Placentia.
Really?
Yes, Father Brad was there for a while after he retired. And I went up to services a few times, and it was very interesting. It was very, and they had 3 steps, so they had to go up 3 steps. I don't know if the 3 steps had special significance.
No doubt it's the Trinity or something.
Go up 3 steps and face the wall, I call it.
Wow.
Oh,
And if you are all interested in a Latin Mass, they have them every Sunday at St. John the Baptist in Costa Mesa.
mm.
I went once. It was quite interesting. I mean, they don't say the sermon in Latin, mind you.
Would you let's have a show of hands. How many people would like to have there be Martin's, we lost him, I guess he's coming back. Like to have a Latin Mass at Messiah.
I proposed it once, and a bell was like, you guys can go ahead and do that on your own. I'm not doing any, I'm not taking part in it, is what he told me.
I was in a Roman Catholic wedding in the early 60s in Anaheim, and the priest was from Ireland, but the whole ceremony, except for their vows, was in Latin. So they were kneeling the whole time and talking to each other as the priest said whatever he had to say.
Well, so no one wants a Latin mass at Messiah.
Oh,
How would you like a Messiah service without communion?
No,
That's the
I-
standard.
I
service.
honestly really liked the morning prayer.
So you would not mind dispensing with communion that much?
Well, I've gone to a church in Boston where they do the morning prayer on Sundays, but right after they have the Eucharist. So you can do both.
Well, but my question is, I'm asking this question because it points up the difference between low church and high church, Presbyterian, Calvinist tradition versus Anglican and Anglo-Catholic tradition. There are obviously some who, for aesthetic reasons, like simplicity, they like plainness. They don't want anything fancy. They don't want any vestments. They don't want gold or silk or candles. They don't want stained glass. They don't want statues. Keep it plain, keep it simple. And just read the Bible and preach about it and go home. Does that appeal to you?
You see, the more structure and ritual and everything else there is in the service, provided that you keep the length of the service reasonable, then that forces the sermon to be short.
Today it was very short.
Do I detect a certain weakening appetite?
I have done Methodism.
I thought, by the way, Katie and Ellery, the 8 o'clock service today, Jim Lee preached very brief sermon.
Yes.
But I thought it was one of the best sermons I've ever heard. He said so much in so few words. I thought it was exceptional.
I'm going to
So-
listen to the recording of it because as I sat there and it was over, I thought, have I been listening? Because Jim's sermons are so good. I have to go back and listen to it after you sang that.
oh, yeah.
I always do that, Julie, because I'm so focused on other things that it's hard for me to concentrate. And so when I listen to the recording, I enjoy listening to the sermon at my leisure, just relaxing. But I wanted to just answer your question, Jack. So having come from a Baptist church where, we only had communion once a month and they brought it to us in our seats, we didn't have to process up and there was no kneeling. And so for me, it was a bit intimidating when I first started going to church with Jean, first the Catholic Church and then the Episcopal Church. But then once I got used to it, now I would really miss it because that weekly repetition, I guess you called it, Martin, and just actually walking up and kneeling and taking communion is very meaningful now to me. And I think I was
kind of joking, but I totally agree with what you're saying. I mean, I'm joking to make a point, but that is the point. Yeah.
And
totally.
there's a beauty and a worshipfulness to it that I wouldn't want to go to like a once a month communion service or something like that personally.
Mhm. Well, I was thinking, because I've understood particularly from 8 o'clockers that, one particular attendee, that it would be nice to have morning prayer. And so I was thinking if we wanted to have variety, we could have morning prayer at the 8 o'clock and the Eucharist at 10 o'clock. And of course, again at 12. But if there's not enough support for that and not a call for it, that's not the case, Linda?
I personally would count that as loss.
Okay.
Well, we had, we just lately, we had one Sunday when Abel was telling his sabbatical stories when we had morning prayer in lieu of Eucharist. And it's there. It is there in reserve, can be done from time to time. And maybe, I mean, it hadn't been done on Sunday in all the time that I've attended Messiah, but I wouldn't mind seeing it once in a while, you know. But I'm certainly deeply wedded myself to the sacramental experience. You know, some reference was made to in the course of the book, I can't recall quite where, to church architecture and how architecture, I think maybe this is part of the Oxford movement. They really revived respect for Gothic architecture, which was called Gothic architecture as a way of saying that it was barbarian architecture. I think the term Gothic was coined in Italy, you know, at the time of the Renaissance. The Renaissance saw itself as brilliant and new, and also reviving the glories of the classical antiquity. And what had come along was Dark Ages. So it was done by the barbarian Germans from the north. Civilization was south of the Alps, you know, Italy, Greece, and so forth. But the one thing that happened starting at the Reformation, and it started in the Counter-Reformation as well, was much greater emphasis on how churches were arranged in order to enhance the audibility of the sermons. I think the term auditory chapel or something was used, but there's also a kind of Baroque architecture that is called Jesuit architecture, and it has the pulpit in the middle rather than at the front. And in certain Presbyterian churches, the pulpit is the most striking architectural feature in the entire building. You know, it's the largest thing there. And there are Anglican churches, Episcopal churches that are strongly under that influence. I spoke once at Trinity Church in Philadelphia, which is the oldest Anglican/Episcopal church in that city. And when I mounted the pulpit, it was as if I were halfway to the roof. A giant structure, really, really big and high. And so you look down, you know, as if you were God. I could imagine, you know, someone preaching a very menacing sermon from this height. Well, architecture can carry a lot of meaning. What I mourn or notice anyway about Messiah Church is that it hides its face. The front door of the church does not face the street, which is usual in churches. Our front door faces toward Maine, you know, but it's cramped there behind a wall, and if the wall were gone and there was a garden stretching out toward Main Street, what you would still see is this forest of wrought iron fencing, which goes around the circular thing that's, you know, that's there just to help the handicapped, you know, that ramp that goes up. But all along that spiraling ramp, you have this forest of wrought iron, and then a very small doorway. So it has a kind of defensive effect. But mostly, you know, even that isn't seen from the street. All you see from the street is blank wall. The kind of thing if you were visiting a European cathedral, there's the facade and all the glory in the front of the church, and then you go down a kind of back side wall or something, and you're walking around the apse of the church, the very back end. But that's what faces onto the corner of Bush and Civic Center. It's an unusual placement that we have ended up with.
Well,
course-
that book does mention architecture in the context of the history of common prayer, and it's important. And one of the things he doesn't mention is that the type of music that works well does depend on the architectural qualities of the building. So if it's got volume and it's got a lot of hard surfaces, then it really favors choral music and organ. So, you know, traditional, as it were. But if you want to play, you know, modern music, if you like, pop music, whatever, that structure really works badly. And I can tell you from experience in England that there are quite a number of, you know, large stone-built churches which have sort of gone to the dark side and do the happy clappy thing, and it sounds terrible in that space.
Well, the happy clappy thing, in my opinion, sounds terrible anywhere. So oh dear.
I always think that it is Vatican II that brought us that.
Yes.
Well, it brought it to the Catholics at least.
Well, yes.
Popularized it, maybe. Yeah.
We once had, we had guitar, we have had guitar on a few occasions, not happy clappy guitar though, but
No.
Carol Harvey plays guitar. She has played
Mm-hmm.
a couple times, and then there was a young man who played the guitar quite well for us. I think maybe just once, maybe even just instrumentally, I think.
And TK has played.
Yeah, that's who you might be thinking of, TK, because
Yes, rather young.
Nancy Whitehead's boyfriend, because he's a
Oh.
professional
Oh, is that so?
guitar. Yeah, he teaches, I think, classical guitar, something
Oh,
like
I
that.
didn't know that. Hmm.
Yeah.
Sarah
And he
Brindle,
teaches at Cal State Fullerton.
Sarah Brindle has sung with her ukulele a couple times.
That's
Right.
right, yeah.
Yes.
But you know what I mean, the whole thing with the guitar and yeah, people are clapping and this.
And the
Yeah.
drums and the yeah.
Well, the exception there is the timpani. I support the timpani. I love it.
No, there's something. I remember thinking some time ago that one of the reasons why, not the kind of Christmas music that is piped into department stores, which by the way no longer includes any of the religious songs. In the department store, you never hear Little Town of Bethlehem or Silent Night. You know, it's chestnuts roasting on an open fire, pretty much nonstop. But the enormous range of beautiful music in such varying styles that we enjoy at Christmas gives me the sense of being put in touch with earlier times, different people, different situations, and I'm carried back, you know, beyond the range of styles and thinking and acting that are normal in my American world, and Christianity seems deeper to me for that sense of its having a long life behind it, and my being put in touch with that. It's like meeting an ancestor almost in person, you know, through the music. Linda, you're muted, Linda.
Unmute.
The dogs were barking, so I had to chase them out. This feels like an apropos time to read my quote.
Very good. I was just about to call on you.
Across time. This is a quote from Carl Sagan. What an astonishing thing a book is. It's a flat object made from a tree with flexible parts on which are imprinted lots of funny dark squiggles. But one glance at it and you're inside the mind of another person, maybe dead for thousands of years. Across the millennia, an author is speaking clearly and silently inside your head, directly to you. Writing is perhaps the greatest of human inventions, binding together people who never knew each other, citizens of different epochs. Books break the shackles of time. A book is proof that humans are capable of working magic.
Wonderful.
Beautiful, yeah.
That is
Yeah,
beautiful.
very good.
And I've chosen as the closing prayer really for the whole course until we reconvene. The dedication page from this book, the Oxford Guide to the Book of Common Prayer, subtitle A Worldwide Survey. Here's the dedication. Excepto, and this comes from the Book of Common Prayer, USA 1979. Accept, O Lord, our thanks and praise for all that you have done for us. We thank you for the splendor of the whole creation, for the beauty of this world, for the wonder of life, and for the mystery of love. We thank you for the blessing of family and friends, and for the loving care which surrounds us on every side. We thank you for setting us tasks which demand our best efforts, and for leading us to accomplishments which satisfy and delight us. We thank you also for those disappointments and failures that lead us to acknowledge our dependence on you alone. Above all, we thank you for your Son, Jesus Christ, for the truth of his word and the example of his life, for his steadfast obedience by which he overcame temptation, for his dying through which he overcame death, and for his rising to life again, in which we are raised to the life of your kingdom. Grant us the gift of your Spirit, that we may know Christ and make him known, and through him at all times and in all places may give thanks to you in all things. The book is dedicated to the memory of Charles Philip Price, 1920 to 1999. So I looked up Charles Philip Price in the index, and he turns out to have had quite a hand, it seems, in the 1979 revision of the Episcopal Book of Common Prayer. So there's a little essay, not actually a very long one, on the 1979 revision, but I'm going to copy that and scan it and send it to all of you.
Thank you.
And-
Thank
Pardon?
you, Jack. Thank you.
You're welcome. And we can have that as well as chapter 7 in Alan Jacobs as at least the starting point for our conversation when we get together in person. So happy Easter, everybody. Thank you so much
Sure.
for giving me this opportunity to spend time with you. It's been wonderful and pretty
It has been
impressive. You know, I'm used to students dropping out of my classes. We haven't had that much of a dropout, so I'm honored.
A good retention rate, huh?
That's right. Very good retention rate.
I'm going to rate my professor.
No, don't you dare. Bye now.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Good night.